Okay, thank you all for being here. And let me thank all of my colleagues who are here with me this morning and for joining together for this enormously important piece of legislation, a bill which would prevent any funds from being used for a war with Iran without congressional approval. In the Senate, this bill is being co-sponsored by Senators Schumer, Leahy, Markey, Wyden, Gillibrand, Baldwin, Cantwell, Warren, Van Hollen, Harris, Blumenthal, and Merkley. Let me also say that I'm very pleased that the House leadership has committed to seeing that Congressman Connor's similar bill and Congresswoman Lee's repeal of the 2002 Iraq AUMF both come up for votes, and I look forward to working with them to get our legislation passed in the Senate. When I look back upon American history, I remember the two most significant foreign policy mistakes our country made in the modern era. And those were the war in Vietnam and the war in Iraq. And let us be clear, we were led into both of those wars by a series of lies. The result, the war in Vietnam cost us 59,000 American deaths, and many others came home wounded in body and spirit. In fact, a whole generation, my generation, was devastated by that war. The casualties in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia are almost incalculable, but they run into the millions of people. In 2002 and 2003, in terms of Iraq, we were told over and over again that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, that he was working with al-Qaeda, and that we needed to invade Iraq unless we wanted to see another 9/11 or even worse, a nuclear attack. Those claims were lies. The war in Iraq led to the deaths of some 4,500 brave American troops and the wounding, physical and emotional, of tens of thousands of others. It led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Iraqis and the displacement of over 5 million people and the increased destabilization of an already unstable region. The war in Iraq cost us trillions of dollars, money that could have been spent to rebuild our crumbling infrastructure, provide quality education for our kids, provide health care for the uninsured and underinsured. And after all of that, after all of the pain and suffering and death and the expenditure of trillions of dollars, the Iraqi parliament voted earlier this week to boot U.S. forces out of their country. And now we have a president who abandoned a nuclear agreement we signed with our allies, has turned to a policy of escalation, and appears to be walking us toward another disastrous war in the Middle East. And let's be clear. Another war in the Middle East could cost, once again, countless lives and trillions more dollars, more conflict, more displacement, and more misery. As a United States Senator, I personally will do everything I can to prevent such a war. Just as we were led into Vietnam and Iraq by lies, the Trump administration is misleading us on Iran. They have justified the assassination of Qasem Soleimani by claiming that he was planning imminent attacks on hundreds of Americans in the region, and yet they produce no evidence that would justify this claim, not even in a classified setting. And that is why it is so important that we are all here today, members of the Senate, members of the House, because under our Constitution, and let us never forget this, it is the Congress that has the responsibility, not the President, for waging war. Our founding fathers understood that it was only too easy for a president to lead the country into a disastrous military conflict. That is why they gave the exclusive power over war and peace to the people's elected representatives. Last year, many of us worked together to pass a war powers resolution on Yemen, in which Congress, for the first time in history, used the powers laid out in the 1973 War Powers Act to constrain the president on matters of war. While President Trump vetoed that resolution, there is no question that it played a major role in signaling to the region, that the American people do not support the Saudi-led intervention in Yemen. And now is the time for us to once again come together and make certain that the president will not have one penny to spend on a war in Iran unless there is congressional authorization. Senator Leahy.
Thank you. Well, I applaud my partner from Vermont and what he's brought here. And when Senator Sanders talks about the lives in Vietnam, I think back to the pivotal vote on Vietnam in April of 1975, when the Armed Services Committee had 4 or 5 votes to continue the war. Each one lost by 1 vote. I remember it very well because I was the newest, most junior member there. But what I remember the most, when the chairman of that committee turned to a very, very conservative senator who had always supported the war in Vietnam and said, "Did you mean to vote no?" He said, "I meant to vote no, Mr. Chairman. They've lied to me long enough." And Bernie, I've never forgotten that. Now if any of Iran's missiles had killed American soldiers at those military bases in Iraq, I think President Trump would have acted much differently and without consulting Congress. And that's a nightmare scenario. We've been on a path to war with Iran ever since President Trump recklessly abandoned the Iran nuclear agreement that our allies had joined us on. For too long, this president and even previous presidents have sent people into war, U.S. forces into hostilities without consulting or obtaining the consent of Congress, and too often the Congress has been a willing collaborator in that. The result is endless wars, thousands of American lives lost, millions of others' lives lost, trillions of dollars wasted. Now, of course, the president, whoever the president is, has a right of self-defense to an imminent threat. But let's not rely on an authorization, which shouldn't have been there in the first place, for the use of force to remove Saddam Hussein in Iraq, something that was passed, and both of us voted against that, was passed based on lies and falsehoods from the then administration to justify attacks now against Iran 20 years later. Yesterday, an administration official, and this, I got to tell you, as the dean of the Senate, this just made my blood boil. They said it'd be a mistake for the Senate to even have a debate about the president's war powers. Read the Constitution. Read the Constitution. He said it would embolden Iran's leaders if they saw that there are differences of opinion among us, if they saw that we're a democracy and we have differences of opinion. As others, including senators in the president's party, said that's an insult, it's dangerous, it belies a fundamental lack of understanding of Congress's role in this democracy. It's our job, it's our responsibility to debate and vote, especially when it involves war and peace in the lives of the men and women in our armed services and their families. So I strongly support Senator Sanders' bill. We should have this debate and have the courage to stand up and follow the Constitution and vote, vote, vote. Thank you.
Ro Khanna.
Thank you, Senator Sanders, for your leadership and courage in stopping war. Thank you, Senator Leahy, for your advocacy on human rights. It must be something about the state of Vermont. Let's be very clear. The power of Congress is the power of the purse. We, in the Progressive Caucus, Senator Sanders introduced these amendments to the National Defense Authorization, which would have stopped, frankly, the Soleimani killing or anything that happened afterwards. The amendment said that we will not fund an offensive strike against Iran or Iranian officials. And Senator Sanders and others, the Progressive Caucus, said we should not hand the Pentagon $738 billion without a restriction on Iran. Now, the White House pushed back, and unfortunately, we didn't stand up strong enough. That hasn't been the history of Congress. See, there was a senator, Senator Church, in 1969, who had amendments to stop the expansion of the war in Vietnam to Laos, Cambodia, or Thailand. And he put in the National Defense Authorization that they won't have any funding. And the Nixon administration pushed back. They tried to get rid of that amendment. But then the Congress didn't acquiesce. They actually passed the Church Amendment to prohibit and stop the war's expansion. And then in 1972, Senator Church again introduced an amendment to stop any funding for Vietnam and the war. And it's no coincidence that Nixon winds down the war in 1973. In 1976, Congress stopped funding for the fight against Angola and the communist regime there. My point is that Congress in the past has been willing to exercise the power of the purse. It's only in this century that we have not. We should have, frankly, stopped the escalation in Iraq. We should have stopped the escalation in Afghanistan. And now we must stop the escalation in Iran. We're not an impotent body. We get to decide who gets funding for these military operations. And this bill says absolutely no funding for an offensive war in Iran.
Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you. I want to start by commending Senator Sanders and Congressman Kana Ro-Khanna for introducing this legislation, and all my colleagues for standing here to stop a war with Iran. The Constitution has been mentioned a couple times, and what this bill does is reaffirms two important principles in the Constitution. One, the Congress has the power to declare war, and two, we have the power of the purse. So what this act says to moms and dads across the country who pay taxes to their federal government, that we're not going to send your sons and daughters to a war in Iran unless the Congress has acted. It's that simple. President Trump should not be able to take taxpayer dollars to send those kids to war unless Congress acts. Now, this bill is very clear that you can, of course, fund acts of legitimate self-defense. But what we've seen from this president, as recently as yesterday from the folks he sent up onto the Hill, is that there was no evidence to support their claim that there was an imminent attack on our forces or the United States. None. And so what we've seen is a repeat of what we saw in those earlier cases that had been mentioned, both in Vietnam and more recently in the case of Iraq, where people manipulated facts, manipulated intelligence, and manipulated the application of the law to justify unnecessary wars of choice. So this act does something else that's very important. It reaffirms that the 2001 and 2002 authorizations do not give the president the authority to go to war. I want to thank Barbara Lee for all her work over many years on that issue, because we've just seen in the last couple of weeks people like Vice President Pence haul out the totally false, totally debunked suggestion that Iran was somehow part of the 9/11 attacks. That is an established lie. Iran's done a lot of bad things, and we all agree on that. But to try to manipulate the facts once again, to try to justify perhaps using 2001's authorization, to attack Iran and other efforts to maybe see shoehorning 2002, which don't apply in any way. So this legislation is absolutely essential. What we've seen from the president's attacks and actions over the last 3 years, including the recent attack, is simply to make Americans less safe and to make Iraq and that region more unstable. So we need to use our authority to stop that, and that's what this is all about. So again, I want to thank all the members here for working to stop an unnecessary war with Iran.
Thanks, Chris. Congresswoman Lee.
Well, thank you very much. Good morning. First, let me thank Senator Sanders and Congressman Khanna for your steady, consistent, and bold leadership. And also, I want to thank all of our senators here today who have come to say that, first, this cycle of violence has got to stop. Make no mistake, Donald Trump is responsible for this crisis. He has shunned diplomacy since day one, filling his cabinet with warmongers and war hawks. Today, after 19 years of endless wars, which I opposed at every step of the way, I stand with my colleagues to say that the American people do not want another unnecessary war of choice in the Middle East. Now, let me be clear. The dangerous and reckless actions taken by Donald Trump have brought us to the brink of an all-out war with Iran and has made us less safe. Now more than ever, Congress needs to exercise our constitutional responsibility to stop these endless wars. That includes passing Senator Sanders and Congressman Khanna's No War with Iran Act, which I am proud to co-sponsor. And also, just as an appropriator, let me tell you, the power of the purse has got to be exercised and used at this point. This was passed with bipartisan support in the House in the 2020 bill, our NDAA bill, but it was stripped by Republicans and the Trump administration from this bill. Now we know why. We've seen the disastrous consequences of a war based on faulty intelligence before. Again, in 2002, I don't know if you remember this, but I offered an amendment when the authorization to use military force against Iraq came to the floor. This amendment said that, hold up, let's let the inspectors determine whether or not there are weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. We wanted the inspectors to go to verify the supposed weapons of mass destruction before any military action. I think we got maybe 72 or 73 votes, unfortunately, for that amendment. But even then, as flawed as the 2002 AUMF finally was, it was never intended or written to authorize future actions against a country that had personnel in Iraq. Neither was the 2001 blank check, which I opposed. This administration has falsely claimed that the 2002 AUMF could be used as the congressional authorization to attack Iran. That's completely outrageous. U.S. military deployments carried out pursuant to the 2002 AUMF, dubbed, remember, Operation Iraqi Freedom? That officially ended in 2011. And the United States recognizes the sovereignty of Iraq and considers the Iraqi government a key ally. We've known for years that there is no military solution in the Middle East, and it's past time to return to a diplomatic strategy with our allies, including insisting that we look at how we get back into the nuclear deal, the JCPOA. The path to peace is not through waging war. We cannot allow this president's irresponsible and irrational decision-making to drag us into another catastrophic war in the Middle East. Together with the American people, we can come together and put a check on this president and stop the march to war. I want to thank you all again. I want to thank Senator Sanders and Congressman Khanna and all of our colleagues here today for really coming forward and raising their voices and, yes, using the power of the purse to say no to war, and the Congress is going to finally exercise its constitutional responsibility. Thank you again.
Senator Gillibrand.
Thank you, Senator Sanders, for bringing us here today. The crisis we are facing today in Iran was both unnecessary and avoidable. Without seeking congressional authorization or presenting any clear strategy, President Trump has brought us to the brink of war. I'm greatly relieved that Iran's retaliatory missile strikes did not result in casualties of any U.S. service members caught in the middle of these hostilities. The President's actions have damaged our relationship with Iraq. Their call to expel U.S. troops would create chaos and enable ISIS to regain their power. Make no mistake, President Trump has made us less safe. The founders of this country gave only Congress the power to declare war. They understood the danger of giving too much power to one person. They understood that when war is waged, it is the American people who bear the brunt, who make the sacrifice. Congress must assert its authority before it's too late. That's why I am sponsoring the No War with Iran Act to prohibit the President from taking any further military action involving Iran unless he notifies Congress immediately and obtains our authorization. I urge my colleagues to support this critically needed bill immediately. In addition, Congress should debate and pass my War Powers Reform Resolution, which would repeal the 2001 and 2002 AUMFs. The law will require a war powers authorization based on a clear explanation of the goals of military action, our adversaries, the countries where the service members would be sent into conflict. Based on the 2001 and 2002 AUMFs, we have deployed to 20 countries against terrorist groups that didn't even exist when those authorizations were passed. It will stop funding for wars after 2 years unless Congress passes a new authorization. We, as Congress, must restrain this president and future presidents from using open-ended authorizations to unilaterally engage in military actions of their choosing. We must end this abuse of power. We must end the abuse of the War Powers Act, and we must pass No War with Iran Act today.
Thank you. Congresswoman Jayapal.
Thank you so much, Senator Sanders, for your fierce and passionate and committed and consistent leadership on this and so many issues. Representative Khanna, it is such an honor to be able to work with you as the first vice chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. And Representative Lee, thank you for your long work on this, which inspired me 20 years ago. Senator Cantwell, it's great to be with my own home state senator and Senator Gillibrand. Thank you. I want to make 2 points about why we're here. First, we are exercising our authority and our obligation to assert our power over going to war. Second, we have to use all the tools in our toolbox. And the very biggest tool in our toolbox is the power of the purse. And so that is why the Congressional Progressive Caucus, 100 members strong in the House of Representatives, 40% of the Democratic caucus, has endorsed both Representative Khanna's bill and Representative Lee's repeal of the AUMFs of 2001 and 2002. And we are working very closely with leadership. We hope to bring those to the floor in the next week. We understand several things. Number one, war is devastating. It is devastating. Hundreds of thousands of people lose lives just in the war in Afghanistan and Iraq. That's been true. We know that families are split. We know that countries are destroyed. And we know that it continues, the impact continues for generations to come. What we also know is from our classified briefing yesterday, from all the information you have, there was no actual evidence, no raw intelligence provided to us of any imminent threat. And the result of that means that we are significantly less safe, because had we stayed in the Iran deal, had we not put forward a maximum pressure strategy, had we not assassinated General Soleimani on false claims that somehow the 2002 AUMF covered this, we would be in a safer place. And yet today, we stand on the brink of war, and it is up to us, the United States Congress, to reassert that fundamental authority. Americans do not want endless wars. Americans certainly want us to learn from our mistakes. It is 17 years ago next month that as an organizer, we organized the largest anti-war protest in Seattle, 50,000 people strong at the Seattle Center, and I stood there to speak before the crowd with my predecessor, Congressman Jim McDermott, to say that we could not go to war because we did not know that there were weapons of mass destruction. So let us learn from this. Let us pass this bill, as well as the repeal of the AUMF and a strong war powers resolution, to say that this is Congress's job, and it's time we do it.
Senator Campbell.
Thank you, Senator Sanders. Thank you, Representative Cohen, and all of my colleagues that have been here, but especially want to thank my Congresswoman for her leadership in the House of Representatives, and to be here with Senator Lee and Gillibrand. Congresswoman Lee is very right. We need to get back to the JCPOA. The U.S. Constitution is clear. The president cannot go to war without the authorization of Congress, and President Trump needs to follow the law, and Congress needs to hold him accountable. This bill creates the very important bright line that specifically calls out our actions related to Iran and can help us in preventing further escalation. Congress will use the power of the purse to stop from putting our men and women in harm's way with the president, and that is what we need to do in passing this legislation. As my colleagues have said, even Republicans agree the president needs to be held accountable for his actions in the Middle East, and he cannot go to war before he comes to the Congress. We need a strategy to deal with Iran. This involves our allies and diplomatic solutions for the region. We do not need to start another war, and we need to make sure that Congress does its job by using the power of the purse. I thank my colleagues for being here today.
Okay, any questions? Yeah.
Senator Sanders, you were in that briefing where the administration laid out their thought process for this attack. You described it as the evidence being lacking. You put air quotes around imminent. If you could, as much as you can, realizing that it's a classified briefing, go into the specifics by why you thought their evidence was thin, and what more you'd like to see from the administration about their response here.
Ryan, you don't have to take my word for it. I think you can hear what several Republican senators who were in that hearing had to say. Hear what Mike Lee had to say, what Rand Paul had to say. Those are guys I don't always agree with. Bottom line is, we did not hear that there was any imminent attack being planned against the United States, period. Yes.
On the topic of the briefing, were there particular briefers or members of the administration that you were disappointed with?
I was disappointed with the overall quality of the briefing. Yes.
You mentioned the Iraqi parliament vote to kick out U.S. forces.
Yeah.
If you win the election, how long would you want to keep U.S. forces in the
Look, I have, I voted against the war in Iraq. I voted against the first Gulf War. I will do my best as president to bring our troops home as soon as possible, but I will not do it through a tweet. I will not do it by creating a situation where we get kicked out of a country. What we need to do is work with the government of Iraq, work with other allies in the region, and make sure that in an orderly way we bring our troops home. Yes, sir.
Given where the situation is now, what steps do you think President Trump needs to take at this point to resolve these tensions?
I think, first of all, he needs to understand and come to Congress and say, I have read the Constitution of the United States, and I have no intention of engaging in warfare unless I have authorization from the United States Congress. That would be the most important thing that he could do. Yes, sir.
Why has Congress in the last 10 or 15 years been so reluctant?
That is a great question. That is an excellent question, and I think it is fair to say this is not a new problem. And somebody else can jump in as well. I mean, I think perhaps the answer has been the fear that somebody will be seen as being soft on terrorism, not prepared to defend the troops, or whatever. But the truth is, we have seen under Republican and Democratic administrations, Congress not utilizing its responsibility under the Constitution of the United States. I am very, very happy, as members here have mentioned, that as a result of the disastrous, horrific Saudi-led intervention in Yemen, which has cost the lives of tens of thousands of poor people in a desperate country, finally, the House and the Senate did the right thing. Unfortunately, that was vetoed by the president, but we finally used the authorization of the War Powers Act to do the right thing. Okay, yeah.
Are any of you going to be calling for the intelligence, any of it to be declassified and then made public, or even just certain parts of it?
Well, I think as much information as the American people can receive is certainly justified. Anybody, I've been doing all the talking here, Barbara.
Well, I just want to call your attention to one statement that the Pentagon publicly issued right after the assassination and the military strikes. Their statement said that, and this was the final conclusion of their statement, the final paragraph in their statement was that the military action was conducted to prevent and deter, and I'm paraphrasing the statement, I don't have it right in front of me, but to prevent or deter future attacks. Now, as it relates to the imminent threat, I'm still trying to understand what future attacks meant. Did this mean imminent? Did it mean past? Did it mean current? Did it mean future? And so I would hope that the press drills down a little bit with the Pentagon to ask them, because they did not use the term imminent threat in their initial statement right after the attack. And also, just with regard to why Congress has been missing in action in many respects, I think Senator Sanders is absolutely correct in terms of the notion that reining in any president would mean that we are soft on terrorism, which we are not. And I believe that the public has been way ahead of members of Congress, and now the voice of the people are being heard very clearly, very loudly, that they do not want another war.
I'm going to have to run and see if I can catch a vote. I don't know. Okay, good. All right, thank you all very much. Great job.
Okay.